In the 70s and 80s, we saw LGBTQ plus students fighting for the rights to be recognized by the institution, the right to be seen, and the right to exist as they were. For more than a decade, the Gay Alliance group fought for the university's official recognition as a student group, as well as the same access rights and financing that any of the other student groups had before. Through a series of legal battles, both at the institutional level and all the way up to the state Supreme Court, and much hardship and obstacles thrown at their way, they persisted. In the 90s, we begin to see the support for LGBTQ plus students begin to be more institutionalized. In 1991, after a needs assessment was conducted to establish a women's center on the Norman campus of the University of Oklahoma, Leslie Kelman, a program development specialist at Goddard, was a key player into getting the Women's Outreach Center up and running in 1999 as part of student life. For almost 10 years, the center supported the community by offering referrals and services for women. Some of those initial programs at the center included the Sister to Sister Mentoring Program, World AIDS Day Quilt, Women in Wheels Auto Maintenance Workshop, the Clothesline Project, Rape Awareness Week, etc. In 2007, Kathy Fall stepped into the roles of the director of the Women's Outreach Center and reimagined the work of the center to be more inclusive of LGBTQ plus students.
So I started in 2007, and it was the Women's Outreach Center at the time. And primarily the focus was on, typical or traditional women's center work, the vagina monologues, there was the Sexperts program, some outreach that was happening on campus. And there was a history of the Women's Outreach Center partnering with the student organization GLBTF, which is what it was called when I started here. And that student organization would put out events and programming. There was a partnership and support through the Women's Outreach Center, but it was informal. And the burden of the work of supporting the LGBTQ plus community fell on a student organization, which I don't think was right. That there was a need, especially in a state that one would say sometimes is not always welcoming to the LGBTQ plus community, and students coming from all across Oklahoma and even Texas who maybe didn't have welcoming, affirming experiences in high school. Like, there was a significant need to support that community more formally.
Recognizing the students' needs as well as the importance of raising awareness and educating others about the LGBTQ community, Kathy brought multiple programs to campus in hopes of creating a more welcoming community where students could feel safe and supported to better enhance their success. The Women's Outreach Center also hoped their programs would educate the OU community to reduce prejudices and barriers faced by the LGBTQ plus students, as well as to reach out to students to provide different resources on and off campus. One of the programs that Kathy brought to the University of Oklahoma was the Ally Training in 2008.
I was lucky enough to have a vice president at the time who had heard about Safe Zone programs and wanted us to consider starting that. And that's how the LGBTQ Ally program came to be. So I had this early support, which is really important to note. Leadership said, there's a need, we should do something here. And two of the decisions I made early on that I think were really important. One was there was a conversation about maybe just having a general safe zone, safe for all kinds of people. And I felt like that was not what the intention of a safe zone program was, that really it's hard to identify people who are LGBTQ plus allies on campus. And so making it explicit was important. And the second decision I made was that we weren't just going to pass out signs. So that was another consideration. Just pass out signs to people who said they were allies and they could put them up. And sure, that helps with visibility, but it doesn't actually educate anybody about how to better serve the LGBTQ plus community. And so instead I created, at the time, it was like a 4-hour training on how to support our LGBTQ plus students. And I was supported in that effort. So I appreciate that and could move forward. I also want to acknowledge that I am a straight cisgender ally. And I know that this should come from the community. But I think at that time, historically on campus, that it took somebody with the privilege that I carried at that time to move this initiative forward. And so I think that's important to recognize. The first people who went through training were within the Division of Student Affairs and Student Life. And it was just support and positive feedback for how we could improve it and how we could roll it out. And the first year, I think maybe we did a couple trainings to the broader community. And at that time, it was easy to get those early supporters, people who were already allies or already members of the community, who were looking for a place to come together and seek, support, conversation, fellowship, finding each other. And so, and then from there, it grew. Each year, it grew more and more as those allies went out and did what allies do: educate, talk, be present, be visible.
After attending the training, one could sign a commitment form in which they would commit to help LGBTQ students succeed, feel safe, supported, and included on campus at the University of Oklahoma, and work to educate others about LGBTQ issues in hopes of reducing prejudice if they wish to. Allies are identified on campus by buttons or signs that carry the official ally logo. By wearing the ally symbol, they commit to create an affirming environment and be a resource for the LGBTQ community.
And more people were like, well, I want to learn more, or I want to have that sign. And honestly, people wanted the sign. And, I understand that was symbolic to a lot of people and still is, I'm sure. But that was kind of the hook to say, okay, you just can't have the sign though. You have to come to training. And then also we want you to actually engage after you go to training and do something on this campus to make it better, whether it's in your classroom or as a resident advisor, that's something that you do. And that was one of the things, probably in the maybe second year, we were able to get the support to have all resident advisors trained as allies. And I think that was really important because the living space is where there can be a lot of areas of sometimes discrimination, harassment for people who identify as LGBTQ+. And so having resident advisors more knowledgeable and willing to step in was really important.
I think it's so nice that we have that kind of ally training on campus and around campus, that being able to see my professors having that sticker up in their window when I go to office hours or something like that. It's nice to be seen and to be visible on campus.
I do remember my sophomore year of college, I was a resident advisor. So that was the first time that I was actually, I think I wanted being required to do the ally training. And it was a pretty extraordinary experience. I mean, clearly it wasn't just RAs who were doing it, and it was packed. And by that point, I started noticing all of the ally stickers around campus. At that point, it felt like nearly every administrator's office. And it was actually between that, my freshman and sophomore year into junior year, that me and some friends wound up starting a fraternity on campus. And ultimately, our entire fraternity did the Greek ally training, which was also fairly new at that point. I think the programs wound up helping students and faculty and staff just learn how to have what are now pretty normal conversations, but gave us a vocabulary, a vernacular, of how to actually approach the conversations, how to approach our own feelings in social situations, and oftentimes, check our privilege of our own limited lived experiences versus, other students. And needless to say, that goes for me as an openly gay student at the time, but also an openly gay student that only reflects one very specific lived experience compared to a lot of other students.
The training was facilitated across 3 University of Oklahoma campuses. Many were designed to tailor to specific groups on campus. The Ally program has expanded since 2008 to also include Greek students and faculty, pre-service K-12 teachers, university staff, and medical and counseling services. As of 2022, we have trained over 11,000 OU community members across different campuses and programs.
Another program that started then was the LGBTQ+ Program Advisory Board. The board is made up of undergraduate and graduate students who volunteer their time to help advise student affairs on program opportunities that help to educate the broader campus community, as well as build awareness and support for our LGBTQ+ students. Throughout the year, the LGBTQ+ Program Advisory Board hosts many events to help educate and raise awareness.
We started with LGBTQ Ally, and one of the things that came out of that is that the more we talked about it, the more people who identified it and were part of that community said, we want more services and programs. We want to be represented. We want to be seen. And so we started the LGBTQ Program Advisory Board. So again, a way to make sure student voices and voices of the community were central to the programming that was happening on campus. And that was the first time we moved into the programming arena of events. And some of those were tied to the Ally program. So, the Ally meet and greet for that first week of school where allies and first year students would come together. But some of it went beyond that to be just programs and education for members of the community in terms of what they were interested in learning about and needing support and education and resources and socializing and fun, which is a big part of what coming to college is about, and also understanding your own identity and place in the world.
In 2012, there was the first designated role of a graduate student who was dedicated specifically to LGBTQ+ programs and students. Casey Catlett took on that role and later became the assistant director for LGBTQ+ programs.
I really struggled with my identity when I first started to realize that I identified as gay. And I think it goes even before that, like before I even knew that I identified as gay. I knew that I wasn't like the other boys on the playground, or I knew that I wasn't like my dad or my stepbrothers or what I saw on television. I mean, I definitely grew up in a time before, representation existed on TV, or at least more appropriate representation. So I really struggled with who I was and my identity, and when I felt comfortable coming out to people, and that definitely came out in stages. So in a lot of ways, joining LGBTQ programs as a graduate student really pushed me into kind of the public sphere. This is my identity. It's wrapped up in the work that I'm doing. And then having to expand my level of knowledge and programming efforts and advocacy work beyond that of self. I mean, I think it's easy to look at that ally development. We oftentimes talk about allyship as people outside of the community, but I think allies can definitely be within your own communities, because we know that even people within our own community can be just as problematic as people outside of the community. But I think oftentimes that's created by internal homonegativity or internal trans negativity that we get from outside populations. And so when I think about my own individual personal development, being at OU at the Women's Outreach Center at the time, and then to the Gender Equality Center, I definitely, there was a learning curve for me of thinking in terms of outside my own identity of a white cisgender gay man, and making it more intersectional in my approach to the work. And so, I mean, obviously, did I do it perfectly? Definitely not. I don't know that anyone does. But as long as you know that those biases are there, or that there's that learning opportunity for you, and it also very much pushes you to do this work not in in isolation, but to do it collaboratively. So you're connecting with different areas across campus, you're connecting with different students across campus, to be able to continue to do that work. So it was very formative for me personally, and then clearly very formative for me professionally. So to be able to connect with all of these students from around the world and faculty and staff from around the world, people who are very much aligned with the efforts and mission of the GEC, and people who are not, and how we could still try to find ways to help them learn and grow, and help move the needle within the campus community. So it was a very interesting learning experience to be able to find ways to work with people who found it challenging to get on board with GEC mission and LGBTQ programs.
In 2015, the Women's Outreach Center changed its name and came to be known as the Gender Inequality Center, better encompassing the work done by the center. While some of the programs have changed over the years, the mission to support students on OU's campus has not. Building awareness through outreach, hosting seminars, and providing resources and referrals are all a part of the Gender Inequality Center today. The center is committed to addressing issues of gender, celebrating diversity, developing leaders, empowering students, and supporting the LGBTQ+ community. While the institution shows more support for the LGBTQ+ community, students continue to advocate for the basic needs of students on campus. One of the notable issues was the fight for gender-neutral housing. By definition, gender-neutral housing is a housing option in which 2 or more students share a multiple occupancy apartment or suite in mutual agreement, regardless of the student's sex, gender identity, or gender expression. Many LGBTQ+ students do not fall into the social norms of the gender binary. It is very difficult for the LGBTQ+ students, especially those who identify as a member of the transgender community, to live in residence halls that specify by gender, such as male or female. In 2009, the GAA student group, then called GLBTF for Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender, and Friends, pressed the administration to include a completely voluntary, opt-in housing option that would permit individuals to live on floors and suites with members of their opposite sex. They reasonably argued that sex-segregated floors do not fully meet the need of every student on campus. In addition to their plea, a faculty-led teach-in was hosted in support of such a move, and the Undergraduate Student Congress unanimously passed a resolution calling on the university to implement these new housing options. Despite all of this, President Boren and his administration continued to block any effort towards additional housing options. When asked publicly earlier that year why he would not allow more housing options, he simply said, "This is Oklahoma."
Right now we're having a rally in support of gender-neutral housing at the University of Oklahoma. And so we've got a large coalition of individuals and student groups that have come together to try and give OU a gender-neutral housing option, which means that students have the choice, if they opt in, to room in a dorm situation with someone who is of a different gender than they are.
About 60 University of Oklahoma students rallied on the South Oval on Wednesday, March 7th, in support of a housing policy they say would protect gay students from harassment. The students presented a petition to OU President David Boren. It asked for a specialized housing option for gay and transgender students. Boren appeared briefly before the group, accepted the petition, and said he would study the issue.
I don't just talk about community and family as a slogan. It's very important for me that we create an environment where every single student feels comfortable and where every single student feels respected.
We are Oklahoma. We are Oklahoma, and this is what Oklahoma wants.
I'm going to read it. I want you to know I take it very seriously. I'm interested in your opinions. I understand your opinions, and I think to a large degree, but I'll understand even more when I look at the details of your proposal.
OU's current housing policy requires freshmen to live in on-campus housing and provides housing options for upperclassmen. But the students contend the options do not protect gays and transgender students from bullying and harassment.
This fall, save housing for all. Gender neutral this fall.
March 2011, Students for a Democratic Society attempted to interrupt a prospective student tour to educate visitors about the gender-neutral housing campaign and OU's policies. The Gender Neutral Housing Coalition planned to sleep overnight in Oklahoma Memorial Union's Crossroads Lounge to protest housing policies. OU Police Department officers broke up the protest after students tried to set up a bunk bed and sign. In 2012, President Boren met privately with members of the Gender Neutral Housing Coalition to discuss potential compromises to its gender-neutral housing proposals. In the proposal, Students stated,
"The Oklahoma Board of Regents requires that all students live in on-campus housing for their first year and provides the option of on-campus housing for upper-class students. The University of Oklahoma has undertaken an obligation to provide safe and comfortable living spaces for all these student residents. Safe and comfortable housing creates an environment that allows students to study, learn, grow, and thrive. In service of this obligation, the university has introduced a variety of safety measures and special programs. For example, the university has created a National Merit Floor to serve the needs of its National Merit Scholars and has quiet living floors for students whose academic success is incompatible with louder student lifestyles. However, the current housing policy does not serve the needs of many students who do not feel safe or comfortable in sex-segregated living arrangements. The students adversely affected by mandated sex segregation includes individuals from all backgrounds and sexual orientations, but in particular, sex-segregated housing negatively impacts our gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and queer LGBT student population."
Monday after spring break, we had a meeting with President Boren, and it was a good meeting. I mean, it was 2.5 hours long, and we went over a lot of the very basics of the proposal, which we had hoped that we would be doing more like implementation negotiations.
The policy proposal states that more than 50 higher education institutions have a gender-neutral housing policy, but during an OU Nightly interview with President Boren, he said that it's not such a simple statement.
Sometimes what they call gender-neutral housing is just making individual arrangements with individual students. So every one of those particular programs is different. Every one of those policies is different. What I want to do is what's best for OU.
The policy proposed by OU's G&H Coalition seeks an amendment to the current housing application that, along with other things, adds the option of answering gender identity questions and suggests designating a section of rooms or floor like OU already does for national merit and international students.
It's not like this is going to be just like the, oh look, there's all the queers. You know, it's going to be like this is the gender-neutral housing floor.
A month later, the president announced OU would not adopt gender-neutral housing options, but would create a co-ed freshman area where men and women would live, although still in separate rooms. President Boren said in a statement, "We seek to create a truly diverse sense of community and avoid separation by group identity. We will, however, initiate a series of positive steps to improve the environment for students with special housing issues." A year after members of several student organizations petitioned OU President David Boren for gender-neutral housing, he expanded OU's co-ed housing option for first-year students by over 3 times the amount allocated for the academic year.
So, co-ed housing solves a quarter of the problem of sex-segregated living, in that, yes, you are now living on the same floor as students who identify as different genders, but you are still within your suite living with same-gendered students, and it is still applied to, in most cases, the gender reflected by a birth certificate or government documentation, when in all reality that doesn't change terribly much of the atmosphere from fully segregated housing. There are many students also that don't identify within the binary, and the co-ed floor option still segregates units of suites by binary gender. So students are still not served perfectly in this situation, especially if they identify outside of a traditional male and female binary. Additionally, when handling especially trans and non-binary students on campus, the tendency is to put them on a co-ed floor, usually with their assigned at birth gender, instead of maybe a gender that reflects their identity better. And there's just nothing that accounts for these students right now, so it's not creating a space that's safe or affirming for them.
In spring 2015, a group of students formed Queer Inclusion on Campus, or QUIC, with the purpose to create and advocate for change so that the institution can better support all LGBTQ+ students on campus.
So QUIC really formed because of the courage of Black students on campus, to be totally frank. So there had been a number of very racist incidents on campus, one of which made international news. And Black students had already gotten together and formed their own student advocacy group actually prior to those incidents. And then they really deserve all the credit for those incidents actually being publicized and the university being called out for them. And so watching that happen and seeing Black and African American students really speak truth to power about their own experiences and get the administration to start meeting with them finally. OU Unheard was incredible. And so many of us were really inspired by that. And so I remember the moment that Quick formed was that a group of us LGBTQ friends were at the Take Root, the Red State Reproductive Justice Conference. And we were at a little happy hour to celebrate its conclusion. And someone brought up OU Unheard and what incredible things they were doing. And the discussion went the direction of, I really wish that someone would do something like that for those of us who are LGBTQ plus here at OU. Maybe we could see some actual change. And I remember saying something like, well, we're someone, what if we do this? What if we form a group and try to do some of this? And folks, I think, had a moment of hesitation of like, could we actually do it? And then folks were all in, and that's how Quick was born. It was incredibly stressful. We all had a full or more than full load of classes. We all were, pretty much all of us were working to support ourselves through school in some capacity. I know at the time I was in 2 master's programs and had 2 graduate assistantships, but this felt important enough to take the time and energy to do anyway. And so that was really stressful to try to make change on top of what we should have actually been able to focus on at school, which was getting our degree. And it also felt really high stakes that if we didn't succeed in some way, that it wouldn't just be that we didn't succeed, but that quite possibly it could result in administration refusing to work with other students in the future as well. Or that other students would be so disheartened by our lack of success that they wouldn't feel like they could keep pushing for this after we were, gone. And so there was a lot of pressure I think we put on ourselves to succeed. And I'm glad that we did have some pretty significant wins, even though we didn't get nearly what students deserve, certainly. And I remember the interpersonal dynamics felt really difficult to navigate, where folks were in these positions where they could have almost unilaterally in some cases made these huge improvements for students, and trying to figure out how to convince them to do the right thing, to take a little bit of risk. And we knew the talking points. We knew that the state legislature would probably be upset if there were gender inclusive housing. We knew that these things were going to meet resistance. But then trying to figure out the best way to frame our message so that it would be heard and acted on by administrators. And that was certainly a mixed bag, to say the least. And I think some of it was really disheartening, to be totally honest. I mean, the provost at the time refused to meet with us or acknowledge that we had shown up to the administration building. And that was not unexpected, but it was still difficult to see a chief academic officer refused to talk to LGBTQ students.
The group wrote a 20-page report outlining what LGBTQ+ students wanted to see changed on campus. One of the changes Quick sought was an LGBTQ+ resource center. However, after speaking with OU President David Boren and other university officials, they settled on an LGBTQ+ study lounge as the first step.
So the really interesting thing is that it was basically a flat denial of not only a resource center, but any sort of like dedicated named resources initially. And then one day, one of the members of Quick got a phone call from someone in student affairs, and they said, this is the pivotal moment. The president has said that while there will not be a resource center, that they will create a study lounge as a compromise. And you have 2 hours to decide whether to say yes to the study lounge or get nothing at all. And that was not a narrative that we really publicized, because we were very well aware that if we seemed ungrateful, that what we had been able to convince folks to provide would probably not come to fruition. So to be quite frank, we played some respectability politics, and we knew that we were in the right to ask for a staff resource center. We knew that students needed it. And all of us in Quick were very much realists, that we were well aware that what is right and what is just is very rarely the actual reality that we're going to be able to achieve in our lifetimes. And so our thinking and our conversation in that high pressure 2 hours was, is it worth it to take a hardline stance and say, no, this isn't what we asked for, and then students don't get anything? In what ways might we be playing to our own pride? And in my case, self-righteousness, because self-righteousness is my favorite emotion. Kidding, but versus, we said we were doing this for all students, not for ourselves. And so, would students benefit from something that is an interim measure? And even if it never turned into a resource center, would students still benefit more from that than from us having some kind of symbolic no? And so we went ahead and we called back and we said, we are very happy that the university has decided to provide an LGBTQ named space, and we were glad for it to be a study lounge, and we look forward to further conversations about how we can ensure that the development of a resource center also happens. We started by asking the queer community at OU essentially for buy-in and permission for us to speak on behalf of a broader community than ourselves, by doing listening sessions and asking folks, what are your concerns, what are your needs? And those listening sessions were actually how we identified all of the areas in that report about campus that we said, this is what the community wants. This isn't just the half dozen of us. This is what dozens of people showed up despite the risk of being out and said, this is what we need. So that ultimate goal and priority was really grounding. And then some level of, quite frankly, the idea of harm reduction being sort of adopted into our organizing strategy of, what is it that we can get? What is actually achievable? We're going to ask for everything because we should and we deserve to. And there's no point in compromising ourselves or our values or our asks beforehand, because we're still going to have to compromise down from that. So let's ask for things we really need, and that we were committed to, pursuing the changes that were actually achievable at the time. And I think that's part of why we had as much success as we did, was that willingness to take the things that were not perfect by any means, but think of the ways that they could help students stay at OU and stay engaged and not be so marginalized.
With the renovation of the Gender Inequality Center to a new space, the LGBTQ+ lounge also moved to become closer to the center.
Yeah, I think having that kind of space dedicated to LGBTQ students on campus is great. I've made use of it. Even back during my freshman year when it was away, tucked into a corner and hidden from view, it was nice to have that space. And then now to have it attached to the GEC in a much nicer space, being able to meet with other LGBTQ+ students there and have that kind of space is so meaningful to me.
Community in the GEC lounge, and then just being able to find people so early on really helped me, because even if something bad would happen, I could just go and talk to them. I could go to the GEC lounge and they were there for me. We got really close together. I can go in there and I pretty much know everyone and we can talk, and whenever new people come, we slowly integrate them into the group. And it's been really amazing, because it was the first accepting community that I've been around. My high school experience wasn't the greatest, but here at OU I was able to at least find people who were like-minded and could help me through the things that weren't so great.
Throughout time, we can see the fight for visibility by students continue to persist to make OU a better place. However, our students understood that visibility is no longer enough. We have to create an environment in which LGBTQ+ students feel supported. Over time, the university has become more accepting of LGBTQ+ students. However, this reminds us that progress doesn't just happen with time. Effort from students, faculty, staff, and administrator was made to ensure that progress happened as we are thousands strong. This is our history. It reminds us how far we have come and how far we need to go to make sure LGBTQ+ students on campus feel affirmed and supported by the institution. Follow us to listen to our students' experience and where we go from here at Rainbow Neath the Western Sky.